What's up everyone, I'm back with another vlog. I get out of line a couple times in this session. I end up bluffing a lot, so hopefully we get a couple through. Enjoy. We start off the session with a round of straddles. We see a limp in the low jack and a reg opens 240 in the hijack. It folds around to me in the straddle and I look down at king jack of clubs. I'm going to be 3-betting this hand a low frequency in these positions. Generally, I'm just going to be calling. I want to be a little bit tighter versus the earlier position opens, and I think that my hand plays relatively well multi-way. So I make the call, and the low jack makes the call. We go to the flop with the pot at $130. The flop is the 10 of hearts, 3 of hearts, 3 of spades. It checks through. I think when it checks through here, it's very unlikely that the hijack has a very strong made hand. I expect him to be betting a lot of his overpairs and 10x here, as well as the small frequency of 3x that he has. I'd also expect this specific low jack player to be donk betting some of their 10x here. So I think overall when it checks through, I have a pretty strong range advantage, especially when I have all of the 3x in my range that they do not. The turn is the 10 of spades, bringing in the second flush draw. I think with the massive range advantage that I now hold with all of the full house combos, both 10x and 3x. If I decide to bluff here, I definitely want to be using an overbet. I probably typically want to have a flush draw with my hand, but this specific combo does a good job of blocking a lot of my opponent's 10x that they could have. I think it's a very reasonable hand to turn into a bluff. I don't expect king high to be good here, very often multi-way. I do decide to continue here for a large size, and I bet 95 into 130. Surprisingly, the loose player and the reg call. I think when they both call here, they're more weighted towards middling pocket pairs, hands like 9s through 4s, and some flush draws. I think primarily the stronger flush draws are going to be calling here, although I'd expect the loose player to call with a large frequency of all their flush draws. I would expect the reg to be folding some of their weaker flush draws. Overall, I still think that we have a massive range advantage. I would expect a lot of their 10x holdings to be raising here, and we have a much higher frequency of 10x and 3x in our range even after both of them call. The river is the 6 of clubs, which doesn't really make anyone netted hands except for possibly pocket 6s, but even pocket 6s is still behind a 10 here. I think I definitely want to shut down a high frequency when both players call on the turn, but I think in this specific scenario a bluff will get through a high frequency, so I decide to go for it, and I bet 425 into 415, just over pot, and both players quickly fold, and we get a nice little bluff through early on in the session. This hand occurs about an orbit later. As you can see, the straddles are still ongoing. We see a $40 open from under the gun from a very loose player, and it folds around to me in the big blind, and I look down at ace queen offsuit. I think that this is going to be a hand that typically is just calling here versus an early position raise, but against this specific opponent who has a very wide range, I think that ace queen offsuit clearly falls into a value category, and I want to be 3-betting it. I bump it up to 155. I think in hindsight, I would probably be making this a little bit larger, probably around 180, but he makes the call. And we go to the flop with the pot at $325. The flop is the jack of clubs, 4 of hearts, 4 of spades. This is a board that I'm going to be exclusively using large sizes on, and it's going to be a board that I'm betting a very high frequency. It's probably close to a range bet. In this instance, I decided to check with ace queen offsuit with the plan to call any reasonable size bet. I think that this specific board texture does favor my opponent a little bit more than it would otherwise, as I think that this opponent does have a few 4x combos here and a few more jack x combos, as well as they would continue most if not all of their pocket pairs. After I check to him, he decides to put in a small bet of 125, and like I said, I think I have a pure continue here. I'm ahead of all of my opponent's bluffs, and I can improve to top pair on an ace or a queen. We go to the turn with the pot at $575, and the turn is the gorgeous queen of diamonds, giving us top pair, top kicker. At this point, I often have the best hand, and after I check and my opponent checks behind, I think that I very clearly have the best hand, as I would expect all of his queen jack and his 4x combos to be betting on the turn. When he checks back here, I think he becomes somewhat capped. He can still have some 4x combos, but I would expect most of his hands to be medium jack x combos pocket pairs or anything else that he just decided to stab flop with, something like ace 5 of hearts or just complete air like 8-7 of spades. We go to the river, which is the jack of spades. Not my favorite river card, as my opponent clearly could have a lot of jack X combos here. I think that my hand is still a little too strong to check. I think that I do want to value bet with top pair, top kicker. If he does have a queen X combo or a weaker pocket pair, I want to make sure I get value from those. A lot of his queen X combos might bet, but I think a lot of his pocket pairs are going to be checking back. I decide to bet out with a size of 375. I think in hindsight, this is probably too large of a size here. If I'm trying to get called by hands like pocket pairs and ace high, I don't think that they're going to be calling this size too often, and I think I value own myself a little bit more frequently versus a jack X combo. He thinks for a little bit and he does decide to shove, telling the story that he has a jack. I think at this point his story makes sense. The shove is pretty large, and I think at this point, even though we have top pair, top kicker, the amount of value that we have with our queen X combo has dramatically diminished, and I think that I have a pretty clear fold here versus this sizing. The straddles continue, and at this point, we've decided to make this a 5-5-10 game. I open up king queen of clubs in the cutoff to 40, and the big blind defends. The big blind is the same player from the previous hand. We go to the flop with the pot at $95, and the flop is the ace of spades, 9 of hearts, 7 of spades. Checks to me, and I check back. I think that this specific hand has a lot of showdown value with king high, and if I hit a king or a queen on the turn or river, I often make the best hand versus my opponent's pairs. So with that showdown value and very little backdoor draw equity, I think that my hand wants to be playing a high frequency check here. I'd also be checking a lot of my weaker pairs and some of my ace X combos here. I know I said that my king and queen X are good for pairs often, but I do think that my opponent has a lot of ace X combos, and I don't necessarily want to be bloating the pot. We go to the turn. The turn is the 10 of hearts, giving me a gut shot, and my opponent probe bets for $50. I think that generally my hand is going to be a fold here, but I do have a gut shot to the nuts, although it is slightly worse with 2 flush draws on the board, and I do think that my king or queen, if they hit the river, will make me the best hand at some frequency. I also think that my hand makes a reasonable bluff if my opponent checks the river. I also think I have the opportunity to bluff with this hand as I'm in position, and if my opponent checks on the river, I think this is a reasonable candidate on a lot of river cards. So I decide to make the looser call, and I throw in the chips. We go to the river with the pot at $195, and the river is the 6 of diamonds, bringing a 4-liner to a straight. My opponent checks. I think that when he checks here, he's definitely weighted towards 1-pair holdings. I think some of his 2-pair combos would definitely be betting here, and I think almost all of his straights would be betting here. I think it's unlikely that he has too many of the stronger ace X combos either, as I would expect him to be 3-betting hands like ace king, ace queen, and ace jack. When it checks to me, I think I have a pretty mandatory bluff here. I don't have a ton of value in my range, but I think that my opponent is going to be betting almost all of their 8x combos, and I definitely have hands like ace 8, 10 8, 9 8, and 8 7, which would all play a very high frequency check on the flop, would play a call on the turn, and then would hit a straight here on the river. So I think betting here makes a lot of sense for my range. I decide to go with a sizing of around 75%, and I bet 135. He tanks for a long time, and ultimately he does make the call. I show the king queen suited, and he shows jack 9 offsuit for a middle pair. So we got looked up a little bit light here, unfortunately, and we lose a small pot. In this hand, we have an early position open to 40. I look down at pocket jacks in middle position. I think that this is a pretty clear 3-bet against this player, even versus their early position range. I bump it up to 125. Folds around to the big blind, and he cold 4-bets to 325. Even though this player is a reg, I don't think that most people are cold 4-betting a wide range. I expect this player to often have hands like ace king, ace queen, and over pairs, possibly an occasional pocket 10s that we're dominating, but I think that I am often flipping. The reg folds, and I think that pocket jacks is still going to be a pretty clear continue even versus a stronger range, especially when I'm in position. I make the call and we go to the flop with the pot at $705. The flop is the 10 of hearts, 4 of hearts, 2 of spades. Pretty good board for my range. I think that I have a much higher concentration of pocket 10s. My opponent still has a lot of the overpairs, so they're going to have a pretty good range advantage overall, as well as a nut advantage. But obviously this is a very good board for jacks. He continues with a bet of 275, and I have a clear continue here. I think that I can raise here at some frequency, but generally in 4-bet pots, I'm going to be calling. I make the call and we go to the turn with the pot at 1,255, hoping to mostly just not see an ace, king, or queen. Hearts are slightly bad, but at the same time, I think it's very unlikely for my opponent to have too many flushes when it's a 4-bet pot. The turn is the innocuous 5 of diamonds, and my opponent decides to check. At this point, I think I clearly have the best hand. Again, there's not too many scary river cards. It's really just an ace, a king, or a queen. You can definitely bet here for a small sizing and try to get called by ace high hands that have the overcards and the gut shots at a high frequency. I can also decide to shove, but I think when I'm shoving here, I'm more likely to be called by overpairs and I'm folding out some of the ace king, ace queen style of combos. I think that my opponent could have a small frequency of ace 10 here, but jacks should be good. In this case, I decide to check back and see a river. The river is the 4 of clubs, which doesn't interact with either of our ranges. My opponent checks again, and at this point, I'm positive I have the best hand. I decide to go all in for 1,300 effective. I think that my opponent is very weighted towards ace high, but when I took a passive line on the turn, I expect to get called a little bit more frequently by hands like ace king and ace queen. I think that it's hard for me to have a lot of value here. When I check back the turn, I think my opponent would suspect that I would bet a lot of my hands for value and denial. So I think that in this situation, if I'm getting called the same frequency by ace king, if I'm using a small bet or a large bet, I'm going to try to go for it all. Fortunately, after tanking for a little bit, he does decide to fold, and we scoop this 4-bet pot. This is a pretty interesting hand. I definitely get out of line here, so hopefully I can redeem myself a little bit with my thought process. We have a early position open to 50 from a reg. I think that this player is opening a little bit on the wide side from early position. We see a flat from a very loose player in early position as well. I look down at ace jack offsuit in middle position. This isn't a hand that I really want to be calling here. I don't really want to have additional players call behind. And regardless at this point, if I make the call, we will be going multi-way, and this hand does not perform particularly well multi-way. I think that because the reg is opening a little bit on the wide side and the loose player is going to call a lot, I have a good opportunity to isolate the loose player, so I bump it up to $200. To my surprise, the small blind, who's also a very loose player, fold calls the 200, and that brings in both the reg and the early position player, and we go to a flop with the pot at $815. The flop is the 9 of spades, 4 of hearts, 2 of clubs. Overall, a pretty dry board. It checks to me. I'm probably checking this hand the vast majority of the time. In this instance, I decide to bet a quarter pot, as I think even though the players are loose, it's very hard for them to connect here. I don't expect them to have too many massively strong value hands here, as it's really only sets with the disconnection of this board. And I would like to push out a little bit of the equity and make decisions on the turn and river with less players in the pot. For what it's worth, I do think that my 2 overcards are almost always good as well if they come on the turn or river. The small blind makes the call, the reg folds, and the loose player in early position makes the call, and we go to the turn with the pot at $1,415. The turn is the 9 of hearts, which is a very interesting card. I think that this heavily diminishes the value hands that my opponents have. And when it checks to me, I think that it's very hard for my opponents to have a strong hand. I think that either one of these players might lead here with trips. And at this point, I think that they're relatively capped towards single weak pair hands. I guess technically 2 pair on this flop. But I expect them to have a lot of hands like pocket 8s through 5s, 4x, 2x, possibly some ace 5, ace 3. They definitely could have some 9x still. I block some of the strongest 9x combos as well for what it's worth, although they probably only have the suited variety at a high frequency. Regardless, I think that this card drastically reduces their value, and I think that if a heart comes on the river, I can bet very big and represent the flush coming in with the ace of hearts. And I decide to continue to barrel here. I bet 600 into 14-15, and thankfully we get a fold from both players. In this hand, we have a double straddle to 20. I open up King Queen offsuit to $70 from early position. It folds around to the double straddle, which is the looser player that we've had a couple of interesting hands against thus far, and he makes the call. We go to the flop with the pot at $160. The flop is the Jack of clubs, 7 of diamonds, 2 of clubs. He checks to me and I decide to check back. I think that this hand's pretty indifferent to betting or checking. Obviously a bet is fine with the backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, and 2 overcards. But I do think that I have a decent amount of showdown value, so a check is more than reasonable. Generally, I'm going to be betting a lot of my strong hands here as I'm in position, but I'm definitely going to be checking some overpairs at some frequency here, a small number of sets, and a lot of my weaker jacks, something like Jack 10 and some Queen Jack, which are the 2 weakest jacks that I would be opening from early position. We go to the turn, which is the 10 of hearts, giving me the open ender with my overcards now. So we have hit one of our back doors. He decides to lead here pretty large and bets $125. I think that my hand is perfectly fine as a call here in position, but I think that my showdown value has definitely diminished somewhat, and I think that I do want to play this hand as a raise at some frequency. I still have some strong overcard hands. I have pocket jacks here, some pocket sevens, and I definitely have a very high frequency of Jack 10, pocket 10s, and 9-8. So I do think I have a lot of nut hands here. So I think this is a pretty reasonable candidate to use as a bluff. I bump it up to $400. He thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. And we go to the turn, which is the 5 of diamonds, which really doesn't interact with either one of our ranges. He checks, and I think I have a pretty big decision here. I think that I'm going to be barreling any club river, trying to represent the flush. Obviously, any overcards are pretty good for me, as well as a 9. Probably checking back a little bit more frequently on some lower board pairs or something like an 8 that makes a 4-card straight for him. And I'm pretty indifferent, I think, in general on some of these blank cards. In this case, I decide to go very large and I overbet to 1200, trying to really put my opponent in a tough spot. I think that when he calls the raise on the turn, he does have a lot of pair plus draw hands here. Stuff like 10-9, 8-7. I can't really easily defend an overbet on the river, and he has some stuff like 10x and 7x of clubs, which is kind of in the same boat. My opponent also has hands like King Jack, Queen Jack, which are obviously a little bit stronger, but are also going to have a very difficult time versus an overbet. I would expect my opponent to back raise with really nutted hands like a set or 9-8 on the turn. I think it's very hard for them to have very strong holdings here. And with the river being a blank, I think it's very unlikely that they have a 2-pair hand as well. So I think an overbet makes a lot of sense here. My opponent tanks for a very long time and ultimately does make the fold. And we scoop this pot with a pretty big bluff on the river. This is a little bonus hand at the end of the session. A lot of people have trouble flopping sets, and I thought that this hand would be a good representation on how to do it properly. First, you want to start with a pocket pair. In this case, I have pocket 6s. I open from early position to 40. I get a call from the middle position player, a call from the button, and a call from the straddle. We go to the flop with the pot at $170, and the flop is the ace of spades, jack of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 2 of hearts. Just your standard 4-card flop. Unfortunately, we haven't flopped a set yet. In this case, unfortunately, we have a misdeal. The floor is called over, and after a little bit of discussion, it's ruled that these 4 cards will be shuffled back into the deck, and a new flop will be dealt. So we shuffle these 4 cards back in, and we deal out a new 3-card flop this time, which is the 10 of diamonds, 9 of clubs, 5 of diamonds. Again, we still haven't hit a set, so we're going to check, and it ends up checking all the way through, thankfully. We go to the turn, which is the 6 of hearts, and just like that, we've hit our set. Pretty easily done. We just had to see 8 cards. We're loving life at this point, and we're going to try to extract as much value as possible. It checks to us, and I go a little bit on the bigger side, pretty wet board. bet $125, trying to get called by any number of pairs, straight draws, or flush draws. I think that a lot of the straight draws on this board will come with a pair as well and are very likely to continue. I expect to get raised by 2 pair combos and some combo draws. The middle position player makes the call, and the other 2 players unfortunately fold, and we go to a river card with the pot at $420. The river is the king of spades. Not my favorite river card in the deck. Queen Jack obviously gets there, but more importantly, I think that the king of spades, unless my opponent has specifically the king of diamonds or something like king 10, really diminishes their overall showdown value. We're going to go large here just in case they have hit a 2 pair combo, and I bet $325, and unfortunately they quickly fold. Another fun session in Houston. I was break even for the most part, but thankfully that king queen bluff got through on the river. I ended up profiting $981, so I had a very good session overall. As always, I appreciate the support, and I'll see you guys in about 2 weeks. Thanks.